Phones on the table, hands where I can see them. The words hit the gilded air of Aurum like a blade through silk. 5 figures in tactical black had sealed the front doors, not loudly, not violently, not yet, but with the cold, methodical certainty of people who had done this before and intended to do it again. Somewhere in the back of the room a woman screamed. A wine glass toppled. The chandelier, indifferent and blazing, kept its light. At table 1, Rashid Yusupov didn't move. He sat the way he always sat, shoulders back, jaw set, one hand resting on the stem of a glass of Barolo that cost more than the car the lead hitman had parked outside. He had built 30 years of survival on a single, unyielding principle. The man who flinches first loses everything. So he looked at the masked figure pointing a weapon at his temple, and he almost smiled. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what kind of mistake you've just made." He was right. He just had the wrong person in mind. Because while fear moved through Aurum at smoke, while guests pressed themselves against velvet chairs and bodyguards calculated angles they had already lost, one person in the room did not flinch. She did not freeze. She did not reach for her phone. She set down her wine tray, slowly, carefully, like a woman who had been waiting 11 months for exactly this moment. She wasn't a crime lord. She wasn't a rival. She wasn't even, as far as anyone in that room understood, particularly important. She was the waitress, table 3's waitress specifically. 28 years old, dark hair pinned back beneath a bow tie, white apron over a black vest, order pad tucked into her front pocket. She had been carrying plates in this restaurant long enough that the kitchen staff didn't bother to learn her last name. Her name was Helen, and this is the story of how she walked into a professional execution already in progress and decided, in the space of a breath, that she was the only thing standing between 5 killers and the worst night Aurum had ever seen. Not because she was a hero, not because she had orders, but because she was the only person in that room who understood exactly what was really at stake and exactly what she was willing to do to walk out with it. The hitmen thought they were hunting a Mafia boss. They had no idea the most dangerous person in the room had already taken their order. Before we begin, if you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell. No filler, no shortcuts, just the full thing done properly. Hit subscribe so you don't lose us, and if you've got 30 seconds, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into it. Aurum was the kind of place that didn't advertise. It didn't need to. Its reputation moved the way old money moves, quietly, confidently, and always ahead of you. Perched at the center of the city's most storied block, behind a facade of dark stone and brushed brass that gave nothing away from the street, it seated 62 guests per evening and turned away, on average, 400. The chandeliers alone had been imported from a defunct Vienna palace. The wine list ran to 90 pages. The menu changed weekly, designed by a chef who had, at one point, cooked for a head of state, though which one and under what circumstances was a matter he declined to discuss. On Thursday evenings, it was Rashid Yusupov's restaurant. Not on paper, not in any filing, deed, or licensing record that a regulator would ever find, but in every way that actually mattered, in the deference of the maitre d', in the preset arrangement of table 1, in the bottle of Barolo opened precisely 40 minutes before his arrival so that it could breathe. Aurum belonged to Yusupov the way cities belong to the people who build them from the ground up and never once touch a trowel. He arrived at 8:30. He left when he was finished. Nobody rushed him.
Nobody sat at table 1 on any other night of the week, either. Some courtesies in Yusupov's world were simply understood. He was not a large man, but he occupied space the way large men wish they could, completely and without effort. His suits were dark and impeccable. His hair had gone fully silver before he was 50, and he had never once considered doing anything about it. His eyes were the particular shade of gray that managed to look both patient and predatory at the same time, the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years sitting across tables with people who wanted something from him, and learning, always, to want something more valuable from them in return. He had built his empire on arms, on laundering, on leverage, on the quiet understanding that information was the only currency that devalued, and the encrypted ledger that he wore around his neck like a reliquary, like a confession, contained every transaction, every name, every buried secret that kept that empire standing. He never set it down. He never let it out of his sight. Tonight, he was in the middle of making a point about loyalty, the kind of point he rarely had to finish when the front doors sealed. Several tables away, near the service station at the eastern wall, stood the woman everyone had already stopped seeing. Helen moved the way good waitstaff always moved, purposefully and without drawing attention, like a current beneath still water. Her black vest was pressed, her apron was clean. It would not stay that way. She had been working Aurum's Thursday service for 11 months, and in that time she had become, in the estimation of every guest and colleague and floor manager who had encountered her, precisely what she appeared to be: competent, quiet, forgettable. The kind of waitress who remembered your wine preference without being asked, and refilled your water glass before you noticed it was low, and never, ever made you feel observed. She had worked very hard to be that invisible. And as the 5 masked figures swept the room with weapons raised, and the screaming started, and Rashid Yusupov reached slowly for the drive at his throat, she picked up her tray, set it back down, and in the half-second that nobody in the room was looking at the waitress, let herself, for the first time in 11 months, think like exactly what she was. The hitmen had planned for the bodyguards. They had planned for the panic. What they hadn't planned for was Helen, and she had been planning for them her entire life.
She moved toward the kitchen first, because that was what a frightened waitress would do. Head low, shoulders pulled in, one hand pressed flat against the wall as she slipped past a table of overturned chairs and a man in a dinner jacket who had folded himself into something very small and was whispering into his own collar. She touched his shoulder as she passed, a brief, steadying pressure, the kind that says, "Stay down, stay quiet, you are going to be fine," and kept moving, her eyes already scanning the room's geometry with a precision that had nothing to do with floor plans and everything to do with 11 years of field work she was supposed to have left behind. She counted the hitmen by their shadows first, then by their sight lines. Holmes at the front, commanding the room. Watson at the kitchen exit, military posture, weight distributed for fast movement, watching the staff more than the guests, because she understood that panicking professionals were more dangerous than panicking civilians. West at the bar, doing something to her earpiece that Helen recognized as signal management. Romero threading through the tables with the unhurried ease of someone who had done this in tighter spaces and walked out without a scratch. And Deemer, still no visual on Deemer, which meant he'd taken vertical or deep cover, and that bothered her in a specific, practiced way that she had learned to treat as information rather than anxiety. 5 positions, 1 exit unaccounted for. 61 guests who didn't know how close to the edge of something irreversible they were sitting. Helen had worked with worse odds. Once.
In Tbilisi, there had been a safe house, a compromised network, and a 12-minute window to extract an asset before the whole operation collapsed. She and Christopher had threaded it perfectly, had run that building like a clock, like a conversation they'd had so many times they no longer needed words for it. 6 years of partnership had made them something close to a single system. She was fast, he was precise. Together they were something that Interpol had spent considerable resources developing and considerably less time protecting. The order to pull her came through at 11:04 p.m., 9 minutes before the window closed. Anonymous authorization, clean routing, untraceable even after she'd spent 3 months trying, from the wreckage of her career, to trace it. She'd been told to stand down. She'd stood down, and Christopher had gone in alone because the mission didn't pause for personnel changes, and the asset had needed extraction, and Christopher Ensley had never once in 6 years left someone behind. He hadn't made it out. Field error, they'd said, operational casualty. They'd given her a letter with very precise language and very little truth in it, and then they'd discharged her for the unauthorized investigation she'd launched the following morning, and she had taken every burning fragment of everything she'd ever been and built it into something quieter and colder and considerably more useful, a woman who didn't exist, walking into the one place she believed the truth was kept. Every thread had led here, to Yusupov's ledger, to the encrypted record of transactions and names and arrangements that stretched, she was now almost certain, from organized crime into the institutional machinery of the organization that had trained her. Someone had handed Christopher's location to the wrong people. Someone with access, someone with a code she'd heard tonight on a frequency she recognized running through a hitman's earpiece. Helen reached the kitchen door, held it open for a hyperventilating sous chef, and quietly noted that Kenneth Deemer had taken the service corridor to the left. She was not a waitress. She was a woman who had erased herself to find the truth, and tonight the truth had walked through the front door, armed and already running out of time.
She built their profiles the way she'd been taught, not all at once, but in passes, the way you read a room when the room is trying to kill you. Details first, patterns second, intentions third. By the time she'd moved from the kitchen door back to the service station, she had enough to work with, not enough to feel comfortable, enough to begin. Gavin Holmes she'd clocked within 30 seconds of the door's ceiling. He stood at the center of the dining room the way load-bearing walls stand, not prominently, not aggressively, but in a way that made the entire structure depend on him. He wasn't performing authority, he was simply exercising it, which was considerably more dangerous. He'd issued exactly 4 commands since the takeover began, each one quiet, each one final, and in the intervals between them he was utterly still, his weapon held at an angle that communicated both readiness and restraint. Controlled, tactical, the kind of calm that isn't the absence of violence, but its most disciplined form. He was the one she'd have to face last, because going through him early would cost her everything she hadn't done yet. Rita Watson at the kitchen exit was former military in the way that former military people always are, which is to say, not former at all. She stood with her back to the wall and her eyes moving in the specific pattern Helen recognized as a scanning habit, drilled in, not learned. Left anchor, right anchor, center, repeat. She wasn't watching for weapons, she was watching for behavior, for the particular quality of stillness that precedes action, for anyone whose breathing didn't match their posture. She would read a threat before it moved.
That made her the most immediately dangerous obstacle between Helen and the kitchen, and it meant that anything Helen did in Watson's sightline had to be entirely, convincingly human. Pauline West had taken the bar like she owned it, which Helen supposed for the next however long this took she did. The signal disruption was elegant, not a blunt blackout, but a layered interference pattern that left the room's ambient technology appearing functional while rendering it useless, the kind of work that took training and equipment that didn't come cheap. West's hands stayed close to a device Helen couldn't fully see, but could infer from the radius of the dead zone she'd been mentally mapping since her second pass through the room. Communications, jamming, the invisible architecture of the operations control. Amy Romero was the one most people would underestimate and most people would regret. She moved through the guests with something that looked almost like compassion, a steadying word here, a gentle redirection there, and the guests responded to her the way frightened people always respond to the first calm voice they hear. They settled, they complied, they stopped thinking about running. She was the operation's pressure valve and its velvet restraint, and the smile she turned on a trembling elderly woman near table 6 was so precisely calibrated that even Helen, who knew exactly what it was, almost found it reassuring. And then there was Deemer, still invisible, still wrong. Helen pulled a clean glass from the service station and set it on a tray because her hands needed to be doing something that wasn't suspicious, and thought about the encrypted drive hanging beneath Yusupov's collar. Titanium casing, biometric lock almost certainly. 11 months of intelligence suggested it never left his body, not at the dinner table, not in the car, not sleeping. It was the record of everything. Every name that had ever been bought, every death that had ever been arranged, every ghost that had ever issued an anonymous authorization at 11:04 p.m. and walked away clean. 5 professionals stood between her and it. She picked up the tray. She went back to work.
The guest at table 7 was a woman in her late 50s, wearing a gown that suggested considerable wealth and currently making the sound of someone who had temporarily forgotten how to breathe. Helen crouched beside her, one hand on the woman's wrist, pulse check, genuine, and with the other hand reached beneath her apron into the interior pocket she had sewn herself on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks into her employment, using a needle and thread borrowed from the restaurant's lost and found kit, and a patience she'd spent a decade building. The pocket was flat and close to the body, and invisible beneath the apron's front panel. She had kept 3 things in it every shift for 11 months against the possibility of a day exactly like this one. The analyzer's size was the size of a USB drive and rather more sophisticated than that suggested. She palmed it without looking down, pressed the woman's wrist once more with what she hoped read as reassurance, and said quietly, "Slow breath in, slow breath out. You're doing well," which was both a comfort and a diagnostic because the woman's breathing steadied, and Helen used the 4 seconds that bought her to read the analyzer's haptic output against her palm. Deemer's position resolved itself in her mind like a developing photograph. Service corridor, eastern branch, 12 meters from the kitchen's secondary entrance, stationary, waiting for someone to do something foolish and come to him. She wasn't going to do that. The burner chip went into her vest pocket, accessible in under a second. The tactical pen she uncapped with her thumb as she straightened and slid it into the channel along her apron's front hem, where it rested against her hip like something completely ordinary, which it was not. It had been engineered to do 4 things besides write, and she was already running calculations on which of the 4 she'd need first. She moved to the bar.
West didn't look at her directly, which was its own kind of attention, the deliberate peripheral awareness of someone who had trained themselves to monitor without appearing to. Helen set 2 empty glasses on the bar's service ledge, reached beneath the counter for the replacement bottle she had every professional reason to retrieve, and in the same motion fixed the frequency disruptor, the size of a coat button, adhesive-backed, taken from the same pocket as everything else, to the underside of the bar's back panel behind the ice well, where it would sit and breathe and quietly begin dismantling West's jamming architecture from the inside. Not immediately, not obviously, gradually, the way rust works, invisible until the moment the thing it's been eating simply gives way. West glanced at her once. Helen held up the bottle, raised her eyebrows in the universal expression of "just doing my job," and walked back to the floor. Marcus was behind the service partition near the hallway to the private dining room, and he was in the specific physical state of a man who had decided to do something and not yet found the angle to do it from. He was 23, broad-shouldered, and had the look of someone who had spent his employment believing that bravery was the same thing as usefulness. His hand was inside his jacket. His jaw was set. Helen stepped into the partition's shadow beside him, close enough to speak below any ambient pickup, and said 2 words, "Not yet." He looked at her. She looked back with something that wasn't a waitress's expression at all, something leveled and certain and very old, and watched him read it the way people read things that don't have words. His hand came out of his jacket empty. She nodded once. That was enough. Holmes had been patient for exactly 22 minutes, which Helen suspected was all the patience the operation had budgeted for. He moved to the center of the dining room with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had decided something and was now simply executing it, and the room contracted around him the way rooms do when the most dangerous person in them chooses to be noticed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quality of his stillness was its own amplification. "Mr. Yusupov," he said, "the drive." Yusupov looked at him the way he looked at everything, with the patient, assessing calm of a man who has been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for 3 consecutive decades. He set down his wineglass with a precision that was itself a kind of answer. Around him, 2 surviving bodyguards shifted incrementally, calculating angles they had already lost and not yet admitted to losing. "I don't negotiate with masks," Yusupov said. Holmes considered this for a moment. Then he turned to the sommelier, a slight, careful man named Philippe, who had done nothing this evening except exist in proximity to the wrong table, and raised his weapon. "The drive," Holmes said again, "or Philippe has a very bad evening." Philippe made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The room held itself completely still, the way rooms do just before something irreversible happens, every person in it performing the same silent arithmetic of, "Is this the moment? Is this the moment? Is this?" Yusupov said nothing. Helen had been moving since Holmes took his first step toward the center of the room, keeping to the periphery, tray in hand, unremarkable, and she watched Yusupov's face across the dining room with something she recognized as reluctant admiration. 30 years. He had survived 30 years by being the coldest person in every room he'd entered for 3 consecutive decades. He set down his wineglass with a precision that was itself a kind of answer. Around him, 2 surviving bodyguards shifted incrementally, calculating angles they had already lost and not yet admitted to losing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quality of his stillness was its own amplification. Holmes shot the chandelier. The explosion of crystal was extraordinary, a cascade of light and shattered glass that hit the room like a physical force, and the sound of 61 people abandoning composure simultaneously was something Helen felt in her sternum. Tables overturned, chairs scraped, someone hit the floor, and someone else hit a wall, and in the gorgeous, consuming chaos of it, Helen crossed the dining room in 11 steps, reached Yusupov's table, and pulled him down behind the overturned surface with a grip that had nothing whatsoever to do with the deference a waitress owed a patron. He was heavier than she'd estimated and faster than she'd expected, which told her something. They hit the floor together, and for a moment they were simply two people pressed against the underside of a dining table, while crystal rained down and Holmes's voice cut through the noise, issuing revised instructions to his team. Then Yusupov turned and looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at her for 11 months, through her, past her, the unseeing gaze of a man for whom waitstaff registered as furniture. This was different. This was the look she'd spent 11 months avoiding, the full weight of his attention, measuring and precise and deeply, dangerously intelligent. The drive hung between them at his collar, close enough to touch. "You're not scared," he said quietly. It wasn't a compliment. She'd known it wouldn't be. "No, I'm not." He studied her for one long moment, and she watched him begin, with the methodical patience of a man who had survived everything, to ask himself exactly the right questions. We'll be right back in the room with Helen in just a moment. But if this story has you locked in, this is the part where you hit that subscribe button. We drop new stories every week, and you do not want to be the person who misses the next one. Like the video if you're staying with us. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. Now, back to Aurum. Holmes is still standing, the ledger is still out of reach, and Helen has just heard something that changes everything.
There was a shard of crystal buried shallowly in his left temple, and he hadn't acknowledged it. A thin line of blood traced the angle of his cheekbone with the indifference of something that had happened to someone else, and Helen watched him decide, with a composure she found genuinely unsettling, that it was not worth his attention. He had bigger problems. He was evaluating her with the focused intensity of a man who has built an empire on the accurate assessment of other people's intentions, and she could feel the weight of it the way you feel a change in air pressure, not painfully, but inescapably. She reached into her apron pocket, produced a folded service cloth, and pressed it against the wound without asking permission. He let her. 11 months, he said quietly, not a question. 11 months, she confirmed. And you're not police. He said it the way he might observe that the wine was correctly tempered, a fact, established, filed. No. Then what, he said, are you? Helen looked at him across 3 years of grief and 11 months of waiting and the 6 inches of overturned mahogany table that currently constituted the only shelter either of them had, and made the calculation she'd been rehearsing since the doors sealed. Partial truth. Enough to secure his cooperation. Not enough to hand him leverage he could use when this was over, because she had no illusions about what Yusupov would do with leverage. He would use it. That was the only consistent thing about him. "I'm the only person in this building," she said, "who knows exactly how those 5 people operate, exactly where each of them is positioned, and exactly how to take them apart before Holmes decides the drive isn't worth the complication and starts reducing the witness count." She held his gaze. "You have 2 bodyguards left. One of them is 23 years old and hasn't decided yet whether to be brave or sensible. The other one is bleeding from his left side and doesn't know it yet." She paused. "I'm what you have." Yusupov was quiet for a moment. The sounds of the room moved around them, Holmes issuing instructions, Romero managing the guests with her precise, terrible warmth. Somewhere distant, a phone vibrating uselessly against a jammed signal. "You want in return?" he asked. "Right now? For you to stay behind this table and not do anything that reminds Holmes you're still alive." He almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes because nothing did, but it was there briefly at the corner of his mouth, the expression of a man who respects the quality of a negotiation even when he's losing it. Helen pressed the cloth more firmly against his temple and reached with her free hand to check the burner chip's receiver, and that was when she heard it. The signal had been restoring itself for the past 20 minutes, her disruptor quietly unpicking West's jamming layer by layer, and now it bloomed open in her earpiece like a frequency finding itself, and on it, clear and unmistakable, was the Hitmen's radio channel. She almost missed the authentication code beneath the operational chatter. Almost. It lasted less than 2 seconds, a handshake between Holmes's channel and its controlling source, a string of encrypted identifiers she had spent 3 years trying to find from the other direction. She knew that code. She had seen it once, briefly, on a communication log she wasn't supposed to access, time-stamped 11:04 p.m. on the night Christopher Ensley went into a Tbilisi safe house alone and didn't come back out. Holmes wasn't working for a rival syndicate. Holmes was working for Interpol, for the ghost inside it, for the same anonymous authorization that had pulled her off the mission and left Christopher Ensley exposed and walked away clean while she spent 3 years dismantling her own life to find the thread that led here. The blood drained from her face and then returned, and she made sure none of that happened visibly. Yusupov was still watching her. "Something changed," he said quietly. He was, she was reminded, extraordinarily good at reading rooms. "Yes," Helen said, because lying to him about this would cost her more than admitting it. She removed the cloth from his temple, checked the wound with a clinical eye, replaced it. Her hands were steady. She had trained them to be steady, and she was grateful for that now, in this specific moment, more than she had ever been grateful for anything. "The man giving Holmes his orders," she said, "I know who it is." She had come here for a ledger. She had come here for Christopher. She had come here to burn down one network and expose one corrupt handler and then disappear into whatever came after. What she hadn't accounted for was the handler sending someone to meet her halfway. She left Yusupov with Marcus and a single instruction: keep him breathing and keep him quiet. And then she went to work. The exit strategy had existed in her mind as a contingency for a different kind of emergency, a blown cover, a network compromise, a night where Yusupov people made her and she needed to be out of Aurum in under 4 minutes with nothing but what she carried. She had never designed it for this. She had also never designed it for anything else with quite this much precision, which meant it was the best tool she had, and she was going to use it for a purpose it was never meant to serve, and trust that 11 months of memorized infrastructure would hold. She reached the kitchen and found the refrigeration override panel behind the dry goods shelf where it had always been, recessed into the wall beneath a ventilation housing that nobody looked at twice. She pulled the housing aside, entered the maintenance code she had lifted from a technician's visit in her 3rd week of employment, and triggered a controlled cascade drop in the cellar's temperature regulation. Not enough to damage anything irreplaceable, enough to send an alert to every staff display in the building, and, more critically, to flood the kitchen's secondary corridor with a sustained drop in ambient temperature that made standing near the exit a different kind of miserable. Rita Watson lasted 6 minutes before she moved away from the door. Helen was already in the service corridor.
Diemer had made the mistake that careful people make when they've been waiting too long in a confined space. He'd found a comfortable position and committed to it, which meant he'd stopped actively surveilling the corridor's eastern branch. Helen came from the western access through a staff door that didn't appear on Aurum's public floor plans and only barely appeared on its private ones, and she moved along the wall with the specific quality of silence she had learned not in any training facility, but in the field, in buildings where the wrong footfall was the last decision you made. She found him beside a rack of Bordeaux that predated both of them by several decades, and she was very efficient about it, and she was not proud of the efficiency the way she might once have been, and within 90 seconds, Kenneth Diemer was zip-tied to the rack's lower frame with the restraints she'd carried in the apron's secondary pocket, and breathing in the particular way of someone who would wake up with a significant headache and a revised opinion of restaurant staff. She pulled the door of the wine cellar almost closed and went back to the dining room. Romero was the most delicate problem because Romero was surrounded by people Helen needed to keep calm, and extracting her meant moving those people first. The false staff alarm, a fire suppression test notification she triggered through the kitchen display panel, sent a pulse through the restaurant's internal system that meant nothing to the guests and everything to anyone monitoring staff frequencies. Romero's earpiece would have received a directional alert pulling her toward the south service corridor. A professional would verify before responding. Romero verified, found a secondary indicator Helen had staged 11 minutes earlier and moved to investigate. Helen was waiting in the corridor. That conversation was brief, which left Pauline West at the bar, and West had realized something was wrong approximately 40 seconds before Helen came around the service partition, because West was the kind of professional who reads the shape of an operation going quiet and understands what it means. She turned with her weapon already moving and found Helen exactly where she hadn't been a moment before, and in West's eyes Helen saw it arrive. The recognition, sudden and absolute, that the waitress had not been waiting for rescue. The waitress had been running her own operation all along. "Who are you?" West said. "I'm the one who took your signal apart, which means Holmes doesn't know any of this yet. That's the only useful thing you have left." She met her eyes steadily. "I'd think carefully about what you want to do with it." West thought carefully, then lowered the weapon by 3 degrees, which wasn't compliance but was the beginning of a calculation, and Helen decided that was sufficient for now and moved toward the wine cellar stairs because Holmes was down there with Yusupov and the ledger and every answer she had spent 3 years earning the right to find.
The wine cellar smelled of oak and cold stone and something older than either. And it was very quiet in the way that places become quiet when the violence hasn't arrived yet, but has already sent word that it's coming. Yusupov was on the floor against the second rack, conscious in the approximate sense, his eyes open, tracking, the drive still at his collar, his hand pressed to his side where something from the chandelier's collapse had found him more seriously than he'd admitted. He looked at Helen when she came down the stairs, and then looked at Holmes, and his expression was that of a man who has run out of moves and is watching other people play out the end of his game. Holmes stood in the center of the cellar. He had his weapon holstered, which was either confidence or communication, and when he reached up and pulled off the mask, Helen understood it was both. He was perhaps 50, lean in the way of people who have kept themselves functional rather than impressive, with a face that was entirely unremarkable except for the eyes, which were the same quality of alert and patient as his tactical posture, a man completely at home in the moment he was in. He looked at her for a long moment. 11 months, he said. There was something in it that wasn't quite admiration, but was adjacent to it, the professional's acknowledgement of a professional.
That's longer than any of us expected you to last." Helen came off the last step and stopped, 6 feet between them, the Yusupov at her 9 o'clock, the drive at Yusupov's collar, which was what this had always been about, which was what Christopher had died for, which was what 3 years of a dismantled life had been building toward in a direction she had always believed would end with her holding it. "You were sent for me," she said, not a question. "We let you run," Holmes said, with the even tone of someone reporting an operational fact rather than inflicting a wound. 3 years, Helen. Every thread you pulled, every record you accessed, every back channel you burned through, it was watched. You were close twice before Aurum. Both times the handler pulled the surveillance and let you keep going, because you were doing the work, finding the ledger from the inside, doing what none of our assets could manage in 4 years of trying." He paused. "Then you got too close to the authentication trail. The decision was made to let you finish and clean up after." The thing she felt then didn't have a clean name. It was grief and fury, and something beneath them both that was worse, the recognition that Christopher's death had not been the beginning of a conspiracy she was unraveling, but a single instrument in one that had been using her ever since. That her 3 years of running had not been investigation, it had been labor, performed on behalf of the people who ordered his death, who had watched her grieve and chase and sacrifice, and had found it, in their cold institutional calculus, useful. She had come here for the truth. She had been guided here by the people she was hunting. Holmes watched her process this with the patience of a man who has delivered bad news before and understands that it requires a moment. "The drive," he said, not unkindly, "and then you and I don't have to have the rest of this conversation." 6 feet, Yusupov barely conscious between them, the drive within reach of a lunge she might land and might not, against a man who had been doing this as long as she had and hadn't spent 11 months carrying wine trays. She had operated alone for 3 years because alone was the only way she couldn't be compromised again. Alone meant no exposed flanks, no Christopher, no one else in the trajectory of whatever came for her when she got too close. Alone had also brought her to a wine cellar with 6 feet and bad odds and a ghost who had been holding her leash since Tbilisi. She thought about Marcus upstairs with his hand that had come out of his jacket empty because she'd asked it to. She thought about what she'd asked him to hold in reserve, and why, and whether she had known even then that she would need it. She made the decision in the space between one breath and the next, and it was the hardest thing she had done in 3 years, and she did it anyway. She didn't go for the drive. She looked up at the cellar's stone ceiling toward the dining room above and said one word at a volume calibrated precisely for the person she'd positioned to hear it. "Marcus." Marcus came through the cellar door with a 1998 Poyak held by the neck, and he swung it with the particular conviction of a 23-year-old who has been told to wait and has been waiting and is very, very done waiting. The sound it made was not elegant. Neither was Holmes going down. He didn't go down completely. He was too experienced for that, too wired to stay functional through impact. But he went sideways, and sideways was enough. Helen was already moving. She crossed the 6 feet in the time it took Holmes to register the blow and begin correcting for it, and her hands found the drive's chain at Yusupov's collar, and she didn't pull it. Pulling would cost her a second she didn't have. She found the clasp, which she had memorized the location of from 3 feet away in the chaos beneath table 1, and she had it free before Holmes had fully turned. He caught her wrist anyway. His grip was exact and very strong, and she felt the drive in her closed fist and thought with the cold clarity that arrives when the margin reduces to nothing about everything that was on it. She broke the grip. It cost her something in her left shoulder that she would assess later, in whatever later looked like, and spun toward the rack and put it between them and hit the burner chip's activation sequence with her thumb before Holmes had closed half the distance. The chip had been initialized for this single function since the night she'd stolen it from a signals contact in Geneva 14 months ago, and it required 4 seconds to handshake with the cellar's ventilation network transmitter, the only signal pathway West's jamming hadn't fully reached because it operated on a maintenance frequency that consumer-grade disruption equipment didn't bother to cover. Helen had noticed this in her second week. She had planned around it for 9 months. 4 seconds. Holmes came around the rack. Marcus, to his very considerable credit, got in the way again, not effectively, not for long, but for 4 seconds, which was all that was required. The transmission went to 3 recipients simultaneously. The first was a journalist named Vera Sandoval, who had been sitting on a corroborating source file for 8 months, waiting for the primary documentation that would make the story bulletproof rather than merely devastating. Helen had trusted her since Tbilisi, where Vera had buried a source location at personal cost to herself, and trust, in Helen's experience, was the rarest and most load-bearing material in any operation. The second was a parliamentary oversight subcommittee whose chair had been attempting to open an inquiry into Interpol's internal authorization protocols for 2 years and had been blocked each time by procedural mechanisms that required exactly the kind of documented evidence that was now arriving in an encrypted package to a secure legislative inbox. The third was Mara Ensley, Christopher's sister, who was a civil litigation attorney in Edinburgh and had been building a wrongful death case in parallel with Helen's investigation using entirely different methods, and had 7 weeks ago sent Helen an encrypted message through a back channel that said simply, "I'm close. Are you?" Helen had not replied. She was replying now. Holmes hit the floor for the second time, and this time Marcus had the zip ties. Helen had given him 2 in the corridor, with the same economy of instruction she'd applied to everything tonight, and Holmes was, if not finished, functionally contained. Helen stood in the cold cellar with the drive in her hand and the transmission already beyond any possible recall, spreading across 3 secure channels toward 3 sets of hands that would know what to do with it, and she thought about the Interpol handler whose authentication code she had heard tonight on Holmes' channel, whose name was on the drive, whose decision at 11:04 p.m. sent Christopher into a building alone and watched the door close after him. In approximately 40 minutes, that name would not be a ghost anymore. It would be a headline. She looked at the drive in her palm for a moment, this thing she had spent 3 years and everything she had finding, and then she looked at Yusupov, who had watched the entire transmission sequence from the floor, with his hand at his side and his gray eyes moving between Helen and the chip and the door with the calculating patience of a man who is, always, even bleeding, counting his options. She closed her hand around the drive. The data's gone. There's nothing left to kill anyone for. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he let his head fall back against the rack and closed his eyes and said nothing at all, which was the closest thing to concession she was ever going to get from Rashid Yusupov, and she accepted it. Upstairs, she could hear the first faint oscillation of sirens.
The sirens arrived in layers. First local police, then the federal frequency she recognized from the pitch, then something quieter and more deliberate that had no markings and parked at the eastern end of the block and disgorged people in plain clothes who moved with the particular efficiency of institutions that prefer not to be observed arriving. Helen watched from the kitchen's service window for 40 seconds, reading the scene the way she'd been trained to read it, and then she turned away and picked up her order pad from the counter where she'd set it 3 hours and a lifetime ago. The kitchen staff had gathered near the cold storage, 7 people in white, frightened and exhausted, and beginning to understand that the worst of it was over, without yet being able to feel that as relief. She moved through them the way she always moved through them, and someone touched her arm and said something she didn't fully hear, and she nodded once and kept going. The dining room was controlled chaos resolving into procedure. Officers moving guests toward the far wall, taking names, issuing the flat, repetitive reassurances of people trained to manage shock at scale. Holmes was being walked toward the eastern exit by 2 people whose credentials, Helen suspected, would be a source of some confusion to the arresting officers. Romero and West were seated with their hands bound and their professional composure mostly intact. Deemer had been located in the wine cellar corridor and was offering nothing to anyone. Marcus was speaking to a detective near table 3, hands animated, clearly describing events in a sequence that would take considerable time to fully reconcile with the physical evidence. Yusupov was on a stretcher near the entrance, gray-faced and precise, even horizontal, talking quietly to a federal agent with the air of a man who has already begun negotiating the terms of his next existence. He would not see the inside of a courtroom for some time. When he did, the ledger's data would be waiting for him there with the patient permanence of things that have already been made public and cannot be recalled. He had survived 30 years of enemies. He would not survive the record of his own transactions. Helen walked through the kitchen and out the service exit into the alley that ran along Aurum's eastern wall, and she kept walking, and nobody called after her because nobody had thought to account for the waitress. She still had her order pad. She dropped it in a bin on the second block. The apron went 2 blocks after that, folded neatly, set on a ledge rather than discarded, because someone might have use for it, and she had spent 11 months learning not to waste things. The bow tie she kept. She wasn't sure why. She was 3 kilometers away before the first alerts began trending, and 5 kilometers away before the handler's name surfaced in the initial leak, attached to documentation that Vera Sandoval had clearly spent the intervening 40 minutes verifying with a rigor that Helen found deeply satisfying. By the time she crossed the river, the parliamentary chair had issued a statement. By the time she found a bar, warm, quiet, the kind of place that doesn't have a dress code because it doesn't need one, Mara Ensley had posted 2 words on a private channel they'd shared for 7 months. Thank you. Helen ordered a glass of wine, something good, something honest, a Burgundy the bartender recommended without being asked, which she took as a sign of something, though she couldn't have said what. She sat with it for a long time. Weeks later, in a churchyard in Edinburgh, a stonemason made a small correction to a memorial inscription. The cause of death now read accurately, for the first time, in clean-cut stone that would outlast everyone who had conspired to make it say otherwise. A woman stood nearby while it was done, not Helen, but a woman with Christopher's eyes and a civil litigation attorney's understanding of what documented truth costs and what it's worth, and she stayed until the mason was finished, and then she laid something at the base of the stone and walked away. Helen was not there. She was in a city that didn't appear on any file with her name on it, at a small table near a window, with a glass of wine, and nothing she needed to do and nowhere she needed to be. She sat with that, too. It felt, distantly and carefully, like something that might eventually become peace. She didn't rush it. She had learned at considerable cost the price of rushing toward things.
She would let it arrive in its own time, at whatever table it found her at, in whatever city she happened to be in, when it finally decided she had waited long enough. Outside the window, the city moved through its evening without her, indifferent and luminous, and entirely unaware that the most dangerous person 3 blocks in any direction was just sitting quietly, drinking something good, and for the first time in 3 years, simply breathing. That's where we leave Helen, somewhere quiet, somewhere that isn't on anyone's file, with a glass of wine she's more than earned. If this story stayed with you, and we hope it did, share it with someone who appreciates a protagonist who wins without anyone seeing it coming. Subscribe if you haven't already, and leave us a comment. Did you trust Helen from the beginning, or did it take you a while? We read every single one. See you in the next story.